The idea for this podcast didn't begin in a library or an archive or some late night spiral through Wikipedia. It began with a stupid argument in a car. My partner and I were on a long road trip, just hours of empty highway unfolding in front of us, and she was scrolling quietly on her phone, just half watching TikTok to pass the time. And then, at one point, she looked up and asked, perfectly innocently, why is everyone so mad at Russia for what they're doing in Ukraine? No malice, no agenda, it was just a question. But I responded in that moment with all the grace and tact and consideration of a man who'd been waiting all day for someone to yell at. I mean, I came apart at the seams. I lost it. I accused her of being gullible, of swallowing Russian propaganda. She took offense, and rightfully so. We quarreled. We spent the rest of that drive in stiff silence. And it took me days, weeks even, to figure out what had happened. Why such an ordinary question, from the person I love most in this world, felt in that moment like a slap to the face. And I slowly realized my anger was less about her and more a reaction to just everything. A world where a 15-second video that's being stripped of context and algorithmically tuned for outrage can rewrite someone's understanding of a war. A world where centuries-long histories get ground into simplistic ideas that feel good but explain nothing. Where complex, brutal stories involving real people like you and me are compressed into digestible narratives that are easy to swallow, yes, but also so easy to weaponize. It's a world where misinformation isn't just an aberration, but a business model. And she wasn't really wrong for asking. I was wrong for expecting her, or anyone, to spot the scaffolding behind the screen, because really, most of us don't see that scaffolding anymore. And I should know better. I track this stuff. You know, geopolitics, propaganda, information warfare. This is my world. These are things I follow for fun. I'm exactly the kind of person who's supposed to see through it. And then, one day, I looked at my own Facebook feed and realized I'd been had. A few years back, when Facebook launched Reels to compete with TikTok, the algorithm fed me a steady diet of stuff aligned with my interests: technology, engineering, travel. So there were high-speed trains in Japan, temples in Mexico, wind turbines in Norway. But over the course of several months, gradually, imperceptibly, the mix shifted, and suddenly I realized I was seeing high-speed trains from China, athletic robots from China, spectacular new highways in China, cutting-edge architecture in China, a fighter jet, a submarine, another mega project. What happened? Had the rest of the world stopped building cool stuff? And as I started to realize I was seeing propaganda, I remembered that China has a national initiative and a healthy budget that's allocated to raising their profile internationally. They actually want a middle-aged white guy from Canada to be impressed with their culture, their architecture, their technology, their engineering, their military. And to be fair, it wasn't the propaganda itself, because everyone does it. And this particular instance was relatively harmless, but what chilled me was the ease with which it slid in, completely under my radar. And if my own feed can be so subtly manipulated, mine, someone who's actively looking for this stuff, how much more vulnerable are people who don't chase geopolitics for fun? Which brings me back to that moment in the car. My partner wasn't naive. She was operating on the information the modern world gives most of us. Fragmented, stripped of context, emotionally loaded. And my reaction, was it really anger or fear? That in a world where narratives are cheap and context is expensive, objective reality itself is becoming a luxury good. And I think that's what sends me to history. Not for comfort exactly, but because if the present is this difficult to see clearly, even for people trying to pay attention, then what if the only way to develop any immunity is to practice on the past? To find those moments where we already know how the story ends, where the propaganda is identified and the manipulation is documented, and ask, how'd it work? Who'd it serve? And who didn't see it coming? You don't need me to tell you, the modern age is flooded with endless footage, endless commentary, endless claims. But none of it means anything unless we understand where it comes from. And the cruel irony is, our age doesn't so much drown us in information as it drowns us in the illusion of already knowing enough. We skim the headlines and we feel informed. We watch a clip and we feel educated. We hear a confident voice and we mistake it for expertise. The modern crisis isn't ignorance, it's premature certainty. We're overconfident in precisely the moments where we should be cautious, and then we hesitate in the moments that demand conviction. Nothing is easier to manipulate than a person who thinks they already understand. So we confuse information with knowledge. We confuse reaction with comprehension. All while the past gets stripped away piece by piece until what remains are fragments disguised as facts. And look, we talk about social media as if it's some monolithic entity that single-handedly polarized public discourse. But even that's too easy because the erosion starts long before TikTok. For centuries, the newspaper was essentially long-form history in real time. When Lincoln delivered the Gettysburg Address in 1863, papers across the country printed it in full. Not a summary, not a highlight, the whole thing more or less exactly as spoken. The assumption baked into that choice is significant. It assumed that readers would sit with 272 words of carefully constructed argument, turn them over, discuss them, that the public could be trusted with the complete thought. Radio, when it came along, preserved something of that patience. A wartime address from Churchill wasn't background noise, it was an event. Families gathered and listened from beginning to end. The medium was intimate, but also immediate. But it still demanded that you stay with an idea long enough to follow it somewhere. But then something shifted with the arrival of television. Not all at once, but unmistakably. And the moment that crystallizes this for me is the 1960 presidential debate. You know the story, I'm sure. Richard Nixon arrived prepared. He knew his policy. He had the arguments. And by most accounts, people who listened on radio thought he'd won. But those who watched on television saw a pale, sweating man in the wrong suit under hot lights, and they drew a different conclusion entirely. Not about his ideas, about him, about how he felt to watch. And that debate demonstrated in a single evening that the medium doesn't just carry the message anymore. It shapes the message. It becomes the message. And politicians had to learn that lesson quickly. Ideas are too slow. Emotions are faster. Arguments are complex. Images and sound bites are clean. And from that moment, you can chart the drive shifting toward compression, toward the striking image over the careful argument, toward feeling over reason. Not because audiences became stupid, exactly, but because the medium relentlessly rewarded a different kind of intelligence. And so bit by bit, we traded paragraphs for punchlines. 2 decades after Richard Nixon's loss, America hit another political pivot point. Jimmy Carter was not a man built for spectacle. He was a naval officer. He was trained in nuclear engineering. He was a peanut farmer from Plains, Georgia, a man who was very soft-spoken and precise. He read briefings line by line. He was almost stubbornly modest. Jimmy Carter did not project power. He projected sincerity. He believed problems were meant to be understood and then solved methodically. And by 1979, the problems were immense. The United States was dealing with oil shocks, double-digit inflation coupled with economic stagnation, an Iranian revolution that morphed into a hostage crisis, broadcast nightly into voters' living rooms that becomes a symbol of American impotence. Now, these were structural failures. Energy dependence that was decades in the making. Cold War entanglements that would take decades more to unwind. Monetary policy distortions nobody could have rebalanced in a single term. These were global currents, not presidential whims. But the structural explanations didn't survive contact with television. Carter approached these crises like an engineer. He explained, he contextualized. He asked Americans to conserve energy, to accept limits, to adjust expectations. He spoke of a crisis of confidence, a spiritual and moral malaise in American public life, the eroding public trust in government, the turn towards individualism, towards consumption, the loss of national purpose. It was nuanced, and it was thoughtful, and it was honest. And on television, it felt like a burden. The camera doesn't reward nuance, it rewards certainty. Enter Ronald Reagan. Reagan had spent decades learning what the lens loves. He understood pacing and timing and the power of a well-placed smile. And he knew that voters don't do national introspection at the dinner table, they process feeling. And his message was brutally efficient. American decline wasn't structural, it was Carter's leadership. Reagan didn't argue about the intricacies of OPEC policy. He didn't unpack Federal Reserve strategies. He asked one question. Are you better off than you were 4 years ago? And that question swallowed up everything. Gas lines, grocery prices, blindfolded hostages on the evening news. And together they became his evidence for a single narrative. All this happened on Carter's watch. It was reductive. It ignored global forces. It erased decades of causation. It didn't matter. Television doesn't do decades. Reagan didn't have to call Carter weak. He let contrast do the work. Where Carter spoke of limits, Reagan spoke of renewal. Where Carter described complexity, Reagan offered clarity. Carter urged sacrifice. Reagan promised strength. And in the end, that confidence beat competence. Carter's modesty, which was so admirable in person, translated into hesitation on screen. He refused to oversimplify, and that read as uncertainty. His intellectual rigor demanded time and attention, but the medium had precious little of either for him. And in a 10-second exchange, the sharper story wins. In 1980, the medium was the battlefield. A half idea delivered with conviction beat a full argument delivered with nuance. In his essay collection, Languages of Truth, Salman Rushdie argues that history is full of what he calls hinge moments, in which, quote, everything is in flux, everything is changing at immense speed, when the future is up for grabs, and dark storm clouds rush across the sun, and there are plagues and dragons loose in the world, end quote. The implications of that idea fascinate me. What if the Battle of Actium had left Mark Antony master of Rome? What if the Catholic Church had reconciled with Martin Luther? What if Khrushchev hadn't blinked? You know, these are the moments that set the world on a fatal course, for better or for worse. And for me, the 1980 U.S. election stands out as one of those because Reagan's victory sets a stage for decades of shifts around the world, political, economic, ideological, and in whose shadow we're still living today. And maybe we'll still be debating in 100 years whether that shift was good or bad. And maybe Carter really just wasn't a fantastic chief executive, and maybe the 70s were just destined to be a lousy time to be an American. But if the White House really was won on a half idea, on a triumph of emotional truth over factual truth, then it's gotta be one of those great what-ifs of modern history. You see, Reagan understood something that every successful campaign since then has had to internalize, regardless of party. The medium doesn't reward the more truthful candidate, it rewards the more legible one. Obama's Yes We Can operated in this same frequency. It was aspirational, it was emotionally precise, it was deliberately light on specifics. So this is more than just a lesson about conservatism. The lesson of 1980, just as in 1960, was about modern media. And everyone who wanted power eventually had to learn it. But here's the part that troubles me. When public understanding collapses, something fills the void. It always does. Sometimes it's fear or outrage. Sometimes it's a politician offering the simplicity you yearn for. Sometimes it's a foreign power whispering in your algorithm. But rarely is it the truth. This vacuum of ignorance isn't just a misfortune. It's an opportunity for someone. A population that doesn't understand events becomes a population that can be steered, not governed, steered, manipulated, nudged, provoked, harvested. And every era has had people and movements and governments who know exactly how to weaponize a confused society. The less we understand, the easier we are to govern, not thoughtfully, but strategically. Back in 1985, the culture critic Neil Postman warned that we were becoming a civilization that amuses itself to death. His words, not mine. And he wasn't talking about smartphones. He was talking about us, about our growing thirst for triviality, for immediacy, for distraction. Quote, "When a population becomes distracted by trivia, when cultural life is redefined as a perpetual round of entertainments, when serious public conversation becomes a form of baby talk, when, in short, a people become an audience and their public business a vaudeville act, then a nation finds itself at risk. Culture death is a clear possibility." End quote. One has to wonder, what if Postman could see a modern Facebook feed? Or, heaven forbid, a presidential tweet storm? Look, news has always been a product. But what if fear and outrage are the packaging, and the algorithm is the salesman whispering in your ear? Look, someone's lying to you. Someone's coming for you. Someone's stealing your country, your job, your identity, your future. This formula, by the way, even has a name. It's called the outrage industrial complex. And if it sounds to you a little bit like the 2 minutes hate from Orwell's 1984, well, you're not alone. Every era has scapegoats. Once it was witches, or Jews, or Tutsis, or Anabaptists. Nowadays it's immigrants, or globalists, or the rainbow people, or the boomers, or whichever group the outrage machine needs this week. Left or right, the mechanism is identical. Because simple stories feel good. They soothe anxiety, and they give us villains. Delightful, colorful, nefarious, barbaric, one-dimensional villains who are easy to hate, and they spare us from complexity. There's an old saying, I don't know what the origin is, but it's accurate enough. Everything's a conspiracy when you don't understand how anything works. The world we inhabit isn't simple, and the people who tell you it is are almost always pushing something. Imagine your political science professor assigns a 3,000-word essay on the subject of unemployment, its causes, its drivers, its structural underpinnings, its consequences. Now, if you care about the grade and you put in the research, you'll likely identify several major factors, right? Automation, hollowing out manufacturing, globalization and outsourcing, industrial shifts, recessions, pandemics, AI disruption, trade conflicts. But suppose you hand in a paper arguing one cause, only one. What if you said, you know what? It's immigrants. It's immigrants, and they're coming in and taking our jobs and putting breadwinners out of work, and that's why our economy has no jobs. How do you think that paper would go over in academia? Your professor wouldn't fail you for being political. You'd fail because you rejected the complexity of the assignment, which was its very point. You flattened a multi-layered phenomenon into a cartoon. Yet, for our politicians and pundits, that exact cartoon passes for legit political discourse every single day. Ladies and gentlemen, this is the assignment our civilization is collectively failing. Because you see, real problems have layers. Real explanations contradict themselves. Real causes compete and interact. In academia, a one-cause explanation is a joke. In politics, it's a complete platform. Because ideas have to compete for attention in a marketplace built for slogans. History teaches something else, something darker. And at the risk of sounding like a conspiracy nutcase here, let me just point out that forgetting is rarely accidental. Whenever the past becomes too cumbersome or too painful or too politically inconvenient, someone steps in to tidy it up. Governments will rewrite textbooks. Colonial powers will sanitize their conquests. Regimes will bury atrocities beneath patriotic myths. Movements will retell their origins to hide their sins. When a society forgets its past, someone else decides which memories get to survive, who the heroes are, who the villains were, which lessons endure, which mistakes are allowed to repeat. If you happen to be a fan of the reimagined Battlestar Galactica series from a few years back, you'll be all too familiar with a catchphrase, a recurring mantra that binds the whole show together. All this has happened before, and all this will happen again. And it's glib and cheesy, but no less true. Not because events recur wholesale or history runs in perfect circles, but because people keep rebuilding the same arrangements of power and fear and ambition and belief. Different names, different flags, different technologies. Familiar pressures, familiar failures, familiar outcomes. History is the antidote to the half idea, because history refuses to be simple. History is contradiction. History is context. History is the long view our culture is losing, and losing fast. And so this podcast exists for a simple reason. To make sense of the present by pulling it into conversation with the past. Not just for interest or for nostalgia, although those are nice. For our own sanity. For the ability to stay grounded in a world increasingly built to unbalance us. For the clarity to engage in public life without getting swept away by the loudest narrative. For the discipline to resist the systems that thrive when we stop remembering and reflecting and discussing. Here we're going to slow down enough to inquire and reflect. We're going to sit with complexities instead of running from them. We're going to hold competing narratives without demanding a villain. We're going to ask the questions for which our timelines have no patience, and let the answers take as long as they need. We're going to let the chattering of the algorithm fall away, as we let history do what history does best, restore depth to a world that keeps flattening itself. Because careful and thorough storytelling might just be the last refuge we have from the tyranny of the half idea. So, if you're curious, if you're like me, overwhelmed, if you're frustrated by how shallow our conversations have become, and if you want to understand the world beyond the algorithm, then I think you're in the right place. Without further ado, join me now in episode 1 of Time and Again. Let's begin.